There is a ride logged in my memory that does not exist anywhere else in the world. No receipt, no route history, no GPS trail, no passenger name. I've checked the app more times than I can count, refreshed it, scrolled back through weeks of completed trips, even called the support line twice. Nothing. As far as the company is concerned, that night never happened. That passenger never got in my car. Those directions were never given. But I was there. I felt the weight of her in the back seat. I heard her breathe. I smelled something. Old smoke, the kind that soaks into walls over years, the moment she opened that door. And I drove her to a house that burned to the ground 11 years ago. I'm telling you this now because I've kept it inside for 3 years, and silence has not made it smaller. If anything, the silence has given it room to grow. Some nights I still reach over and check the back seat before I pull out of my driveway, not because I expect to find anyone there, but because some part of me, the part that was in that car, is never entirely sure. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 34 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, going through the quiet collapse of a life I had spent a decade building. My marriage had ended 8 months earlier. Not dramatically, no screaming, no thrown plates, no affair discovered, just a slow, polite disintegration, the kind where two people sit across from each other at dinner one night and realize with a calm, terrible clarity that they had become strangers. We divided the furniture. We divided the savings. She kept the dog because, honestly, the dog had always preferred her. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city that smelled like someone else's cooking, no matter how many candles I burned. I started driving for a rideshare company about 2 months after the divorce was finalized. I told myself it was for the extra money, and that was partly true. But the deeper truth, the one I didn't like looking at directly, was that I couldn't stand being alone in that apartment at night. Driving gave me something to do with my hands and my eyes. It gave me the illusion of purpose. Pick someone up, take them somewhere, drop them off. A beginning, a middle, an end. Simple, clean, nothing like real life. Most passengers were unremarkable. Drunk college kids heading back from bars on Burnside, business travelers going to the airport at ungodly hours, couples having quiet arguments they paused while I was present and resumed the moment they got out. I didn't mind. I preferred it, actually, being on the edges of other people's lives, close enough to feel less alone, far enough away to stay untouched. I had settled into a rhythm. Tuesday through Saturday nights, usually from 8 p.m. until about 2 a.m. I knew which neighborhoods tipped well. I knew which venues emptied out at midnight and which ones went until last call. I knew the roads the way you can only know them after you've driven them 100 times in the dark. Every pothole, every poorly timed traffic light, every stretch where the street lamps give out and you're navigating by headlights alone. I was good at the job, maybe too comfortable with it. Maybe that comfort was exactly the problem. It was a Friday night in late October. I remember that specifically because the city still had Halloween decorations up in windows and on porches. Plastic skeletons, orange string lights, fake cobwebs stretched across porch railings. Portland takes Halloween seriously. On another night, I might have found it charming. I had been driving since 8, and it was now closing in on 1:30 in the morning. My last trip had been a perfectly normal one. A young woman from a bar in the Pearl District to her apartment in Hawthorne. 5 minutes, a $2 tip, a polite thank you. I had pulled into a convenience store parking lot, bought a coffee I didn't really want, and was sitting there trying to decide whether to log off for the night. I was tired. Not dangerously tired, but the kind of tired where the edges of things go slightly soft and the music on the radio starts to feel like it's coming from very far away. I had been meaning to end my shift for about 40 minutes. I told myself one more ride. Then I told myself that again and again. I should have just gone home. The request came in at 1:47 a.m. The pickup location was on Northeast Prescott Street, a quiet residential stretch I knew well. Nothing unusual about that. The drop-off address was in a neighborhood out past the city's edge, a rural adjacent area near the Sauvie Island corridor that I had been to maybe twice before. Longer trip, which meant a better fare. That was reason enough, in the state I was in, to accept. I accepted the ride. I pulled out of the parking lot and started driving toward Prescott. She was standing at the curb when I arrived. I almost missed her. Not because it was dark, though it was, but because she stood so completely still. Most passengers move when they see headlights. They lift a hand, they take a step forward, they pull out their phone to confirm the car. She did none of those things. She was simply there, standing at the edge of the sidewalk in a dark coat, her hands at her sides, her face tilted slightly downward so I couldn't see it clearly through the windshield. I pulled up and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, you the one who requested?" She nodded once, a small, precise nod. She opened the rear door and got in. No rush, smooth and deliberate, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this and was in no hurry now that it had arrived. I glanced at the app. Passenger name, M. Stills. "Evening," I said. I usually tried to gauge within the first 30 seconds whether a passenger wanted to talk or wanted silence. Some people get in a rideshare at 2 in the morning because they've been around people all night and just want a quiet ride home. I respected that. Long night? Nothing. No response. I checked the rear view mirror. She was sitting very straight, both hands folded in her lap, eyes directed at something outside the window, or maybe at nothing at all. She looked to be in her mid to late 50s, though I found it hard to hold a clear impression of her face. Her hair was dark gray, pulled back. Her coat was heavy for the time of year. I let the silence settle. Some passengers just didn't want to talk. That was fine. I started driving toward the drop-off address. We had been driving for maybe 10 minutes when she spoke for the first time. Lombard. Her voice was low and flat, not unfriendly exactly, but without any warmth. The kind of voice that didn't seem interested in being heard, only in being obeyed. I glanced at the navigation on my phone. The app has me going via Highway 30. It's a bit faster this time of night. "Lombard," she said again, exactly the same tone, exactly the same volume, as if I hadn't spoken. I hesitated for a moment, then took the turn onto Lombard. It was her ride. Passengers redirected me all the time. We drove in silence. Lombard stretched out ahead of us, long and mostly empty, the storefronts dark and shuttered, the occasional traffic lights cycling through its colors for no one. I turned on the radio very low, some late-night jazz station I'd found a few weeks earlier that I liked for overnight drives. She didn't react to it. About 5 minutes later, left on Fessenden. I turned left on Fessenden. We were moving further from the route the app had plotted, further from the main roads. The streets out here were darker, more residential, the houses set back from the road with wide, dark lawns, fewer streetlights. Something was beginning to form in my chest. Not panic, not yet, just a kind of low-grade alertness, like the feeling you get when you realize you've been walking and don't quite remember the last few turns you took. I checked the app again. The drop-off address was still pulling us generally northwest toward the rural outskirts. We weren't totally off course, but we weren't on the route either. "Ma'am, if we keep going this way, it'll add some time to the—" "I know." That was all she said. "I know." 2 words. I stopped trying to make conversation. We went on like this for another 20 minutes, her directing me in occasional flat commands, never more than 4 words at a time. Right on skyline, left at the light, straight through. Each instruction came just as I was approaching the relevant turn, as if she was reading the road from memory, not from any map or phone of her own. I never saw her look at a screen. Her hands stayed folded in her lap the entire time. The roads narrowed. We were well outside the city now, in the dark seam between Portland's sprawl and the open farmland and woodland that surrounds it. The street lamps had disappeared entirely. My headlights were the only light on the road. The trees on either side were dense and close, their branches reaching over the asphalt in a way that made the road feel like a tunnel. I was wide awake, All traces of tiredness were gone, that kind of alertness that comes not from rest, but from the body deciding on its own that this is not the time to be anything other than completely present. I noticed something else around this time, the smell. I had felt it since she got in the car, I realized. I had registered it on some peripheral level without focusing on it. But now, in the silence and the narrowing dark, it pressed forward. Smoke, old smoke, the kind that soaked into the walls of a building over years, into the wood and the plaster, and stays long after whatever caused it is gone. The smell of something that burned. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was looking directly at me. Not at the window, not at her hands, at me in the mirror, with an expression I couldn't read, not threatening, not pleading, something I didn't have a word for, something in between. I looked back at the road immediately, my hands tightened on the wheel.
Stop here. We were on a 2-lane road with no markings, no signs I could see, dense tree line on both sides. There was no house visible, no driveway, no lights of any kind beyond my headlights. I'm sorry, stop here? There's nothing. Stop here, she said. I stopped the car. I sat very still for a moment, the engine idling, my headlights cutting a yellow cone into the empty road ahead. I was aware of my own breathing, aware of how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that only exists this far from the city, a total absence of ambient noise, no distant traffic hum, no sirens, nothing, just the engine and my breath and whatever was in the back seat. I looked at the navigation app. It was still pointing me forward, another half-mile to the original drop-off address. I looked out the driver's window. Trees. I looked out the passenger window. Trees, and about 30 feet back from the road, something that might have been a gap, a break in the tree line where something used to be. The address you gave, I said slowly, it's a bit further up the... It's here, she said, and she opened the door and got out of the car. No pause, no fumbling with a bag. She was just gone, door swinging behind her, and I watched through the window as she walked, that same smooth, unhurried walk into the gap in the tree line and disappeared into the dark. I sat there for what felt like a full minute, but was probably 15 seconds. Then I did something I have questioned ever since. I got out of the car. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't concern exactly. It was something more complicated and less flattering. It was the kind of compulsion that grabs you sometimes when something doesn't make sense, when the narrative your brain is building has a hole in it, and some part of you refuses to drive away without filling it. I needed to understand what I had just brought someone to. I left the engine running, I knew that much, and I walked to the gap in the trees with my flashlight on. The beam was thin and white and threw long shadows through the undergrowth. The ground under my feet was uneven, covered in old leaves and something harder beneath. Gravel, I realized, the remnant of a driveway. The trees opened up after about 20 feet into what had once been a clearing. There was a foundation, a concrete rectangle, cracked and pushed up in places by years of frost and root growth, filled in the center with debris, black timber, collapsed metal, chunks of plaster, things I couldn't identify in the flashlight beam. Whatever had stood here had burned completely, not recently. The debris had settled into itself the way things do over many years. Weeds grew through it. Saplings had taken root in the ash. A house had stood here, and it had burned, and it had been gone for a long time. I swept the flashlight around the clearing. No woman, no movement, nothing but the ruins and the trees and the dark pressing in from all sides. I called out, "Hello? Ma'am, are you?" and stopped. because hearing my own voice out there, in that silence, in front of that burned foundation, made something in me want to go very quiet and very still and not draw any more attention to myself at all. I walked back to my car. I got in. I locked the doors. I drove back toward the city without stopping. I told myself it had been a strange night and nothing more. A reclusive woman who wanted to visit an old property in the middle of the night for reasons of her own, grief, nostalgia, some private ritual I had no right to question. People did strange things. I had driven them through enough of those strange things to know that the explanation was usually just human and sad, not supernatural. I got home at around 3:30. I poured a glass of water I didn't drink. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand and opened the rideshare app. I went to my trip history. The last completed ride in my history was the trip to Hawthorne at 1:52 a.m., the young woman from the bar, 5 minutes, $2 tip. There was nothing after it. I stared at the screen for a long time, the way you stare at a math problem where you know the answer can't be right, but you can't find where you made the error. I scrolled up and down. I refreshed. I closed the app and reopened it. I checked my phone's GPS history, a habit I had developed after getting turned around in an unfamiliar neighborhood once and wanting a backup record of where I had been. The GPS history showed my route from the convenience store parking lot on Burnside directly back to my apartment. No detour to Prescott Street, no route up Lombard, no route into the dark roads outside the city. As far as every record I had access to was concerned, I had gone straight home after the Hawthorne trip. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and lay down on my bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling until the light changed and it was morning. 3 days later, I searched for fire records for the address the app had shown as the drop-off point. It wasn't hard to find. The county has a public database of historical permits and incident reports. It took me about 20 minutes. A residence stood at an address on that road, a rural property, 3-bedroom farmhouse, built in 1962. On November 3, 2012, a fire of undetermined origin destroyed the structure completely. There were no survivors. 2 people were home at the time. The property owner, a 61-year-old woman named Margaret Stills, and her adult son. Neither made it out. I read the name 3 times. Margaret Stills. M. Stills. I closed the laptop and went and sat in the bathroom with the light on and the door locked for about an hour. Not doing anything, just sitting, just needing walls close around me.
I stopped driving for the rideshare company the following week. I told myself it was because I was tired, because the hours were affecting my sleep, because I had other things to focus on. All of those things were true. None of them were the real reason. The real reason was that I was afraid of getting another request at 2 in the morning that I would accept without thinking, the way I'd accepted that one. I was afraid of what else might be standing at a curb somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone to come along who was lonely and tired and not paying close enough attention. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. The first person I told was my therapist, about 4 months after it happened, and I framed it carefully. I said I'd had a strange, vivid experience that was hard to explain, and that I was having trouble deciding whether what I'd perceived had been real or some kind of exhaustion-induced distortion. She was thoughtful and professional and asked good questions, and we talked about sleep deprivation and the way the isolated mind can construct experiences to fill emptiness, and I walked out of her office feeling like I'd been handled rather than heard. Because here's the thing I kept coming back to. The thing that doesn't fit into the sleep deprivation explanation, or the stress-induced dissociation explanation, or any of the other frameworks I tried to put around it. My back seat. 2 days after that night, I was cleaning out my car. When I wiped down the rear seat, I found something on the upholstery near the left door. A gray hair, long, coiled against the fabric, and the faintest smell. Faint but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Old smoke, deep in the fabric, like it had been there for years. I had the car detailed professionally the following week, spent $200 getting every surface cleaned, every fabric treated, the interior ozone blasted. It helped with the smell, not entirely. There are still mornings when I first open the door, when I catch something that might be nothing, that might be memory, that might be something else. I sold the car 8 months later. I told the buyer it was in great shape, and mechanically it was. I also went back, once, in the middle of a weekday afternoon in broad daylight in a rental car, because I needed to confirm that what I had seen at 3 in the morning was what I thought I had seen, and not some dark road hallucination dressed up as architecture. I found the road. It took me a while. The dark makes distances deceptive, and in daylight the turns I remembered felt different. But I found it. The gap in the tree line was there. The gravel driveway remnant was there. The foundation was there, exactly as I remembered it. Cracked concrete, collapsed debris, weeds and saplings threading through what had once been someone's home. Someone had placed flowers at the edge of the foundation at some point. They were long dead, brown and papery, tied with a piece of ribbon that had faded to an indeterminate color. I don't know when they'd been left there. They could have been there for weeks. They could have been there for years. I stood at the edge of that foundation for maybe 5 minutes and tried to feel something clear, grief or resolution, or the particular satisfaction of a mystery solved. I didn't feel any of those things. I felt only the same low, persistent unease I'd been carrying since that night, the feeling of something unfinished. I got back in the rental car and drove back to Portland and returned the car and took a bus home because I didn't want to be behind the wheel any more than necessary. I've spent 3 years trying to decide what that night was. The rational explanations exist, and I've cataloged them carefully. I was exhausted. I was, let's be honest, not in a healthy place emotionally. A recently divorced man filling his nights with work to avoid the silence, not sleeping enough, not eating well, spending too many hours alone in a car that became, in its own strange way, a kind of sealed-off world. Minds under sustained stress do unpredictable things. Memories can be constructed. The brain, when it needs something badly enough, will sometimes build it from scraps. The name in the app, M.Stills, could have been a coincidence I later made meaningful. There are common surnames. Margaret is not an unusual name. I may have seen those fire records before, somewhere, in some local news story I barely registered consciously, but that lodged itself in some back corridor of my mind to resurface that night in a form that felt like experience. The smell could have already been in the car. The hair could have been from a previous passenger. These explanations are available. I have access to them. I use them when I need to sleep. But here is what I cannot explain away, the thing I come back to when the rational architecture starts to feel like it was constructed for comfort rather than accuracy. She knew where she was going, not in the way someone follows a GPS, in the way someone follows a memory. Every instruction came at exactly the right moment, never hesitant, never corrected. She knew every turn in the dark, out on those roads that aren't on any map I've found since. She knew when to tell me to stop. She walked into that gap in the tree line, into the dark, into the ruins of what had once been her home, without hesitation, without a light, without looking back. Whatever she was going back to, she knew exactly where it was. And I think if I let myself believe the thing I'm most afraid to believe,
She knew I would come. I think something, fate, coincidence, the strange gravity that lonely people carry without knowing it, arranged for a tired, disconnected, grieving man to be parked in a convenience store lot at 1:47 in the morning with his shift not yet ended and his threshold for one more trip still open. And she needed someone to make that drive, or she needed someone to witness it, or she needed something from that night that I still don't fully understand. And I was there, and I said yes. I think about regret a lot, more than I used to, about the difference between regrets that diminish over time, things you did or didn't do that lose their weight as life moves on and covers them over, and regrets that do the opposite, the kind that calcify, that become permanent features of the interior landscape.
I don't regret driving for the company. I don't regret accepting that ride. I think, whatever that night was, it was also something I was meant to be present for. Some part of me recognized that, even in the moment, even when the fear was highest, the sense that this was not ordinary, but that ordinary was not what was required of me. What I regret is simpler and harder to articulate. I regret that I drove away so quickly. I regret that I stood at that burned foundation for 5 minutes in the dark, calling out into emptiness, and then walked back to my warm car and locked the doors. I don't know what I could have done differently. I don't know what I should have said. I'm not sure there were words adequate to that moment, or that words were what was needed at all. But sometimes, late at night, when the city has gone quiet and the apartment feels very small, and I am alone in the particular way that divorced middle-aged men are alone, not just without company, but without the memory of what it felt like to be truly known, I think about a woman standing at the curb on Prescott Street in the dark, standing so still, waiting for someone to come. And I wonder if what she needed more than anything was not a driver, but simply a witness, someone to make the last trip with her, someone to sit quietly in the dark while she went back to the place where her life ended and stood in the ruins of it one more time. Someone at 2 a.m. who had nowhere else to be. The app still says that ride never happened, but I know what I carried that night, and I know where I left her. And sometimes, when I open my car door in the early morning and catch that faint trace of something that might be old smoke and might be nothing, I allow myself to hope that wherever she was going, whatever unfinished thing she needed to return to, she found it, that she found what she came back for, and that she doesn't have to wait for another car anymore.